Last Supper. The tribunal even wanted the dog in front of the table, who sits splayed out, taken out of the composition. The artist tried to point out that the dog, the dwarf, the man with the nosebleed, and the two German guards are all in the foreground of the picture, in other words, in the viewer's space, not in Christ's space. Christ and his disciples are under the colonnade on a stage removed from the raucous elements of the scene. But the inquisitors wanted it repainted. Fortunately for the friars who loved the painting and for the Venetians who resented Rome trying to control their art, the artist came up with a clever compromise. Veronese simply painted in a few inscriptions referencing the 5th chapter of Luke on the railings of the stairs. Luke 5 describes the supper in the house of Levi in which Christ dined with publicans and sinners. By renaming the painting Feast in the House of Levi, it was suddenly okay to have all sorts of riffraff sharing a table with Christ. In fact, the story required it. The Roman inquisitors could do nothing, the Venetians got the picture they wanted. And we all inherited a colorful masterpiece that celebrates the splendor of Venice's golden age. Figure 12-3, in the Feast. In the House of Levi, Paolo Veronese turned a Last Supper scene into a party. Scala Art Resource, New York. Tintoretto and Renaissance Ego. Jacopo Robusti, called Tintoretto, was Veronese's main rival. Tintoretto claimed that his art combined the drawing of Michelangelo and the color of Titian. Whether he reached the perfection of either is still up for debate, but no one can deny that Tintoretto was one of the stars of the Venetian Renaissance, and an aggressive self-promoter. Tintoretto's dedication and his marketing skills became apparent to everyone during the 1565 competition for a painting to hang in the Confraternity of San Rocco in Venice. 5 artists submitted small oil sketches of their designs. Tintoretto arrived with his full-scale ceiling painting San Rocco in Glory already finished. Before anyone could protest, Tintoretto announced that he was donating the painting to the organization. So, how could the artist hope to survive by giving away his art? Well, the San Rocco patrons were so impressed that they awarded Tintoretto a commission to decorate the entire interior of their meeting hall from floor to ceiling. This well-paid job lasted 22 years. The cycle of paintings still hangs in its original location in the Scuola di San Rocco, the best place in Venice to see Tintoretto's work. Tintoretto's St. George and the Dragon displays the artist's energetic storytelling style. St. George was a 3rd century saint who supposedly rescued a Libyan princess from a ferocious dragon. After George killed the beast, the king and all the townspeople converted to Christianity. Tintoretto's altarpiece is a dramatic vertical composition that pulls you in different directions as you try to keep up with the action. In the foreground, the beautiful princess runs toward you, faintly looking over her shoulder. You look over her shoulder, too, and you see George on his white charger spearing the dragon into the sea. Between the damsel and the chivalrous knight lies the corpse of one of the dragon's victims. His body seems to be stretched between the two events. This corpse mimics the pose of Christ's crucifixion. The light source for the painting is God, sending out oval rays in an extraterrestrial light show. This little altarpiece is a high-octane representation of a chivalric Christian legend. Today we have Schwarzenegger on DVD. Renaissance Venice had the action-packed paintings of Tintoretto. Palladio, the king of classicism. The most influential high Renaissance architect was Andrea Palladio. Palladio's style, which is called Palladian or Classicism, is based on the writings of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, c. 70 BC, c. 25 BC, Roman ruins, Renaissance ideals, and his experience as a stonecutter and mason. Palladio's style is formal, elegant, and clean. His hands-on experience as a mason helped him to put Vitruvius's theory into practice with impressive results. Typically, Palladio's buildings have a Roman temple front or facade like the Maison Carré. Most of his work is in Venice and the Veneto where he grew up. One of Palladio's greatest achievements is San Giorgio Maggiore, a Benedictine abbey and church in Venice, begun in 1565. Palladio chose to build the abbey church as a basilica and then impose a classical temple front on the Christian basilica. To make the basilica and classical facade harmonize, he created an interlinked double temple front, a tall one based on the height of the basilica's nave, and a wide one, conforming to the lower height of the side aisles. He interlocked the two fronts into a single-tiered facade with 4 huge columns. Many buildings have been influenced by Palladio's style, especially in England, Ireland, and North America, including the facade of Buckingham Palace, the White House, and the Jefferson Memorial. Late Gothic, Northern Naturalism. Late Gothic art, which developed in Flanders around 1420, was a long way from the elongated, Gothic figures on Chartres Cathedral, built between 1194 and 1220. Late Gothic refers to the new naturalism in Flemish art and had a lot in common with the early Italian Renaissance. Both strove to depict life realistically, to make people look like people. The main difference between Late Gothic and Renaissance art is that Late Gothic artists weren't trying to resurrect Greco-Roman culture as Renaissance artists were. Jan van Eyck, the Late Gothic ace. Jan van Eyck is sometimes called the inventor of oil paint. But scholars now know that oil paint had been used with little success over 100 years before his birth. He is more accurately called the father of oil painting technique, because he mastered the medium better than anyone before him. Using walnut and other oils as his medium, and setting his panels aside to dry after each coat, he built up his illusionist pictures with dozens of glazes. With Van Eyck's paintings, for the first time in the history of art, you really did have to reach your hand out to make sure the image was flat and not three-dimensional. Van Eyck came from a family of artists, and his earliest dated work is the Ghent altarpiece which he and his brother Hubert painted for the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, Belgium, in 1432. Standing almost 12 feet high, and opening to 15 feet wide, the 12-panel Ghent altarpiece pulled out all the stops. The images burst from the wood panels like peals from a pipe organ. Throngs of saints adore the sacrificial lamb, choirs sing, a beautifully dressed woman plays an organ in the painting, Mary, Christ, and John the Baptist preside over the altar like kings and queens, even Adam and Eve join in naked from the sidelines. After this giant outpouring, Van Eyck preferred to work small. Virtually every other work of art he did was on a modest, intimate scale. His pictures got more lifelike and detailed, but it was as though you were looking through a little window to witness their magic. One such window onto a domestic scene is Jan van Eyck's The Arnolfini Wedding. The double portrait is a reminder of how much people traveled at the time. The man is Giovanni Arnolfini, an Italian merchant from Lucca who lived most of his life in Bruges, Belgium. He and his wife are dressed stylishly in fur-lined garments, but not so lavishly as to be mistaken for royalty. The greeting chamber in which they are shown has an expensive bed, but the walls are not covered in expensive tapestries and the floor is bare wood. Besides trading in silks, merchants from Lucca often imported oranges and lemons from Spain, which sold at a premium. An orange appears on the window ledge and 3 more are casually spread on the wooden chest to suggest the wealth of the couple and perhaps the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden. In fact, every object in the painting has a literal and a symbolic meaning or meanings. Freighting objects with meaning was the norm in Netherlandish art. The cute dog between the couple, for example, is a standard symbol of fidelity. But he's also an expensive breed, an Offenpinscher, suggestive of the pair's wealth. Burgundian and Dutch women wore their dresses with the train gathered in front, making them look pregnant whether they were or not. Though many have speculated that the woman is pregnant, it wasn't customary to depict pregnant women in 15th century art. Nevertheless, the carving on the left post of the chair beside the bed is of Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Some art historians believe that the painting depicts an actual wedding and have dubbed the painting the Arnolfini marriage. One scholar has argued that the couple have kicked off their shoes to show that they're standing on the holy ground of matrimony. A solitary marriage candle burns overhead, and Giovanni raises his right hand as if to take his vows. The convex mirror on the back wall shows the reflection of 2 figures, perhaps witnesses to the marriage, and the signature on the back wall declares, Jan van Eyck has been here, 1434, as if he were one of the witnesses, possibly the one with the red turban in the mirror. Figure 12.4, Jan van Eyck's The Arnolfini Wedding is poorly named. Scholars aren't sure whether the couple is already married, in the process of marrying, or only engaged. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Although many scholars still accept the wedding interpretation, there are some major weaknesses in the argument. Giovanni di Arrigo and Jean did not marry until 1447, 13 years after Van Eyck did the painting. Lorne Campbell has suggested a cousin, Giovanni di Niccolao Arnolfini, is a better candidate, and that this is a portrait with his second wife. As to the holy ground of matrimony, the couple have only removed their overshoes. Giovanni still wears black boots. No evidence has been found that lighting a single candle was a marriage tradition of the time, and most couples joined their right hands during their marriage ceremony. If Jan van Eyck were actually witnessing the event, in the way a wedding photographer might document the occasion today, it's strange that he didn't give the exact date. Several of his other portraits give the exact day they were finished. Some scholars have suggested that the couple is already married, and others propose that they're betrothed but have not yet tied the knot. Whatever the state of their wedlock, the relationship between the couple is intriguing. Their hands are joined, yet each stares solemnly into his or her own world. Rogier van der Weyden, front and center. Jan van Eyck didn't have the corner on the realist market. Another artist called the Master of Flamenco, now generally identified as Robert Campin, also painted realistic images in oil. He was especially good at lifelike portraits and small devotional altarpieces, like the Merode altarpiece. However, Campin's achievements were overshadowed by his pupil, Rogier van der Weyden, whose large and dramatic altarpieces introduced a new and often painful emotionalism in northern religious art. The earlier Gothic art was dramatic and emotional too, but because it's less realistic, its emotionalism doesn't penetrate the viewer as deeply. Van der Weyden figures aren't symbols, they're real people in despair or some other powerful emotional state. He dramatizes emotion by placing his figures front and center. Sometimes he includes a background landscape. Rogier van der Weyden's deposition is carefully choreographed to play upon the viewer's feelings. The figures are so realistically modeled that they appear to be actually standing in front of the stone wall behind them. They look like characters in a passion play performing on the edge of a stage. Notice that Mary's drooping body echoes the body of Christ. This implies that her love for her son is so intense that she feels what he feels, and part of her dies with him. The cross-shaped composition reinforces the theme of the painting, while giving van der Weyden a perfect frame in which to set up his symmetrical arrangements of people. Two weeping women with similar poses and white head wrap stand on either end of the horizontal axis of the painting. A pair of people on the left tend to the fallen Mary and hold up her arms. A pair on the right tend to Jesus, one of them supports his legs. Joseph of Arimathea, in the center, and the man on the ladder form the vertical or y-axis. The descending arrangement of these men helps the viewer to feel the weight of Christ's body as it sinks toward the ground. Their bowed heads, Jesus's dangling arm and drooping form, and the man descending the ladder, all contribute to the painting's downward pull. Notice that van der Weyden used contrasts to break up the symmetry while preserving the painting's overall balance. The triads of people on either side of the horizontal or x-axis balance and contrast with each other. The positions of the heads of the middle figures contrast. One is lower than his two neighbors' heads, and the other is a bit higher. On the vertical or y-axis, Joseph of Arimathea stands on the left side of the cross, while the man on the ladder stands on the right. The balanced arrangement of the mourners helps to make their collective sorrow converge on the dead Christ in the center of the painting. Northern exposure, the Renaissance in the Netherlands and Germany. Trade with Venice, Florence, Rome, and other Italian city-states exposed northern countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands to Italian art, igniting a renaissance in the north. Italian Renaissance artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Benvenuto Cellini, who moved to France to work for King Francis I, and northern artists like Dürer and Bruegel, who studied in Italy, also helped transport the Renaissance spirit and style northward. Like the Italian Renaissance, the rebirth in the northern countries inspired artists to depict earthly life naturalistically and imaginatively. In the following sections, I focus on the paintings of the Netherlands and Germany, where the new emphasis on Renaissance humanism created a demand for portraiture and genre scenes, and where religious fervor sparked some of the most visceral and violent Christian art. Decoding Bosch. The Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch painted some of the darkest images of humanity ever created. His most famous work is a triptych called The Garden of Earthly Delights. One look at this painting is enough to convince you that Bosch was as pessimistic as he was devout. In his painting, the whole world seems stuck on the sensual life and bound for hell. Apparently, to Bosch, even listening to music was a sin. As gruesome as his depiction of hell is, it may be the most creative vision of the inferno ever conceived. On the left panel, Christ introduces the newly created Eve to Adam in an Eden inhabited by peacefully grazing animals. In the large middle panel, which represents life after the fall of Adam and Eve, naked people cavort, flirt, and ride horses and pigs in what looks like a sexual funhouse. Although the Earthly Delights panel is intended to warn man to forsake his pleasure quest and turn to God, it seems designed to turn people on rather than off. The right panel shows the price man pays for a life devoted to satisfying the senses. The Garden of Earthly Delights is stuffed with images. There are probably as many interpretations of it as there are image combinations. To read this painting, it's helpful to look for patterns, parallels, and inversions between the three worlds, Eden, Earth, and Hell. Notice that the clear sky and the green hilly landscape of Eden continue into the middle panel, Earth. There are geographical correspondences in Hell, too. Each panel includes a cutout oval pond. Even in Paradise, the pond is inhabited by grotesque, hybrid creatures, a black unicorn, a flying fish, a duck-like creature perusing a book. Man's future looks gloomy already. Each landscape also has a lake. In Eden, ducks cruise the clear waters. On Earth, naked folks frolic in what looks like a water theme park, and in Hell, people boil in an infernal soup. Notice that in the left and middle panels ominous owls eyeball mankind like an all-seeing conscience or to foreshadow his doom. Birds flit through each section. In Eden, they fly blissfully through blue sky. On Earth they morph into giant fowl, cutting through the air with winged people and flying fish and griffins, perversions of nature. In medieval lore, witches were believed to corrupt nature by stealing eggs and sperm from humans and other species and mixing them to create hybrids. Their goal, to replace God's and nature's harmony with discord. In Hell, tiny black birds take off from the rectum of a man who's being swallowed by a giant bird. Bosch's hybrids may have been inspired by medieval manuscript drolleries, see chapter 10, but he's taken drolleries to a new level of weirdness. Edenic fruit reappears in the fallen world as an apple orchard from which people freely pluck and eat. Giant strawberries, blueberries, and cherries are conspicuous features of the middle panel, suggesting that mankind lives only for his pleasures, which loom larger than everything else. Notice that people and birds offer each other fruit as the serpent did in Eden. Future hybrids are suggested by interracial mingling and by a man cozying up to an owl, although the owl appears indifferent to his advances. In Hell, pleasure is transformed into pain. The fiery pit is divided into different torture arenas for each pleasure: the gaming arena, the music room, the toilet bowl, a hole in hell into which one man vomits, another excretes gold coins, and a man-eating bird defecates undigested people. In other arenas, animals maul and bag the hunters who preyed upon them, and beastly personifications of lust fondle gluttons and lechers. In the music room, musicians and music appreciators get punished for pleasing their oral sense rather than praying. Their lutes and flutes become instruments of a torture. One man is crucified on a harp, another is racked on the strings of a lute, while another is impaled by a hunchback as he incessantly grinds out tunes on an oversized hurdy-gurdy. The gaming section of Hell features fallen cards, dice left forever on a table, and a spilled pitcher. A die tottering on a woman's head suggests that gambling was how she balanced her books in life. A naked man is sandwiched between a gaming table, a ravenous beast, and an impaled hand with a die perched on its fingertips. The latter image implies that even without a body or head to direct it, the hand is still banking on a lucky roll. In Bosch's Hell, people don't give up their pleasures, they're tormented by them. Deciphering the dark symbolism of Grunewald. The German painter Matthias Grunewald took Gothic drama even further than Rogier van der Weyden. He depicted intense, often violent emotion more effectively than any other Renaissance artist. His grim paintings of the crucifixion depict the horrors of Christ's gruesome death with vivid realism. Grunewald's most powerful rendering of the Passion is in the Isenheim altarpiece, painted for the Abbey of St. Anthony Indiana Isenheim, Alsace, between 1510 and 1515. The left panel shows an impassive Saint Sebastian impaled by arrows, the right panel depicts the mild Saint Anthony, in the bottom, Christ is in his tomb, mourned by the two Marys and Joseph of Arimathea. But it's the dramatic center panel that grabs the viewer's attention and won't let go. Christ's battered body hangs so heavily that it bows the horizontal arm of the cross. His outstretched fingers scratch at the sky, and his muscles strain with anguish. The bright red cloaks of John the Baptist on the right and the Apostle John on the left echo the color of the blood flowing from the wound in Christ's chest. Grunewald expresses the intensity of Jesus's last moment on earth as viscerally as Mel Gibson does in The Passion of the Christ. Rigor mortis has already set in, freezing Jesus's final agony, which Grunewald depicts with brutal realism. Grunewald's most terrifying work is The Temptation of St. Anthony, painted from 1510 to 1515. According to St. Athanasius, who wrote the life of St. Anthony, when Anthony retreated to the desert to live an ascetic life. The devil fought with Anthony on several occasions, surrounding him with temptations and vicious demons. In The Temptation of St. Anthony, Grunewald depicted a bevy of strange beasts persecuting the saint. The vivid primary colors that Grunewald uses help to dramatize the scene. Dining with Bruegel the Elder. The Flemish painter Peter Bruegel the Elder specialized in landscapes and scenes of common people working in the fields, eating, hunting, and skating, as well as flirting, drinking, and raising Cain. In bars. His depictions of peasant life are full of rough-hewn people and rustic charm. Paintings like The Peasant Dance and The Wedding Dance are magnificent windows into 16th-century peasant life. According to Bruegel's first biographer, Karel van Mander, Bruegel enjoyed crashing weddings and village fairs with a buddy. Wearing peasant garb. They came to the wedding bearing gifts like everyone else and claiming to be members of the family of the bride or groom. Bruegel took pleasure in studying the appearance of the peasants. He also knew how to represent these peasant men and women most exactly. Bruegel is famous for his partying peasant scenes like Peasant Dance and Wedding Dance. In the animated Wedding Dance, red pants, shirts, and skirts, interspersed over the canvas among greens, browns, and white hats, pants, and aprons, create a visual dance rhythm for the eyes. You feel as though you're gyrating through the space with the dancers. Not only did Bruegel capture the essential character of peasant life, but he used landscape to evoke moods, as in his The Hunters in the Snow, which depicts peasants hunting, working, and ice skating and fishing on a frozen lake in a winter landscape. The painting was part of a series of works representing the months of the year. The Hunters in the Snow represents January and February. The figures are shown from a distance or with their backs turned to the viewer, the composition and frigid landscape, bleak sky, and distant alpine peaks, not the people, communicate the painting's moods and messages. Of course, there are no mountains in Antwerp or Brussels where Bruegel made most of his work. So how did he paint such convincing glacial peaks? In about 1552, Bruegel, like many northern artists, journeyed to Italy to study the masters of the Italian Renaissance. He was above all impressed by Michelangelo, by Venetian landscapes and peoplescapes, probably by artists like Titian, Giorgione, and Vittor Carpaccio, and by the majestic Alps. He filled notebooks of sketches of the Alps, which he later used in his paintings in Antwerp and Brussels. His biographer said Bruegel swallowed the mountains on his Italian trip so he could spit them out later in his studio. He spit them out for the rest of his life. But Bruegel had a darker side, too. Like Bosch, who was one of Bruegel's greatest influences, and Grunewald, he sometimes ventured into the world of the macabre, for example, in his Dull Giant, a chaotic landscape inhabited by giant demons and ranting people, and in The Fall of the Rebel Angels and the Triumph of Death, c. 1562, the first two works look like Bosch could have painted them. In fact, as a young artist, Bruegel was paid to imitate Bosch, whose popularity soared after his death. In The Triumph of Death, an army of skeletons massacre humanity in countless gruesome scenes. The invading armies of death look like endless streams of Grim Reaper clones, and remind viewers of the Black Death, which decimated Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out roughly half the population. Chapter 13. Art That'll Stretch Your Neck, Mannerism. In this chapter, stretching the rules, reviewing perspective, adjusting to Mannerist architecture. The High Renaissance elevated artists. From makers of art to creators of art. In the wake of this promotion, artists began to assert their individuality. After the students of Raphael and Andrea del Sarto mastered all the High Renaissance rules like scientific perspective and orderly, geometric compositions, they began breaking the rules to make art that was more stylish and expressive. Scholars generally call this style Mannerism, but they don't agree on which artists should be labeled Mannerist or even how long the style lasted. Most scholars believe that Mannerism extends from 1520 to 1600. The term Mannerism comes from the Italian maniera, a word that artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari used in the 16th century to signal the high intellect and refined skill of Michelangelo's style after about 1520. Vasari wrote that, when the Mannerist style first appeared in Michelangelo's Medici chapel, it broke the fetters and chains that had earlier confined to the creation of traditional forms. Maybe it's like learning to ride a bike. After you master the basics, you want to start doing tricks, things the bicycle wasn't designed to do. What does Mannerism look like? When you celebrate the artificial over the natural by exaggerating proportions, distorting perspective, or even shaping a backyard hedge into an arched entrance, you're being a Mannerist. If the great Mannerist artists were alive today, many of them would probably be hanging around the fashion shows of Paris or Milan. Artists such as Francesco Primaticcio or Parmigianino would be quite at home sketching the lanky runway models, with their collagen-enhanced features and extravagant clothing. Mannerist Madonnas have a stylish artificiality all their own, and sometimes the clothing worn by attendant figures is as form-fitting as Calvin Klein underwear. The angular features and sulky expressions of Mannerist faces seem to communicate haughty refinement even as they beg for your emotional empathy. Part of the reason that Mannerism seems like such an aristocratic art is because it served the tastes of the Medici family in Florence, the French kings at Fontainebleau, and Emperor Rudolph II in Prague. The pictures commissioned by these patrons often have veiled erotic symbolism that only a select few were ever meant to understand. Even Mannerist gardens require the visitor to be reasonably well educated and art-savvy in order to appreciate the various orders of architecture and how they've been playfully adapted. The Orsini Garden at Bomarzo, Italy, for example, displays an assortment of jests, tricks, and architectural styles, including a so-called leaning house, trick fountains, and seductive sirens and ancient gods carved into the large outcroppings of lava rock. Patrons of Mannerism had a good sense of humor and liked the type of beauty that surprises with its strangeness. In Italy, at the end of the High Renaissance, Michelangelo's style moved toward Mannerism. The elongated forms in his Pieta Rondinini are classic examples of his late Mannerist style. In this chapter, I examine paintings in which limbs are elongated, emotions intensified, and backgrounds transformed into symbolic or visionary landscapes. Then I show you how Mannerism stretched architecture to its limits. Pontormo, front and center. Jacopo da Pontormo was one of the first Mannerist painters. He may have studied under Leonardo da Vinci. Scholars know for sure that in 1512, Pontormo became an assistant of Andrea del Sarto, from whom he learned to master the High Renaissance style. 5 years later, Pontormo broke ranks and helped launch Mannerism. Pontormo's Descent from the Cross is one of the earliest Mannerist masterpieces. It shows two young men carrying Christ's body in the company of mourning women. Pontormo virtually eliminated depth from the painting, moving almost all the figures into the foreground and stacking them on top of each other like a Cirque du Soleil pyramid. Instead of depth, the painting has height. Moving the action into the foreground enabled Pontormo to intensify the emotion. It gives the viewer a close-up of everybody's feelings. He further removed the event from ordinary reality by dressing the figures in baby blues, soft pinks, and olive greens, not exactly the colors of tragedy. Some of the cast wear pink and blue, skin-tight clothing that shows off their expressive postures and their bodies. The artificial colors and mannered perspective make the painting poetic rather than dramatic. Pontormo softened tragedy into visual lyricism. The whole scene rests delicately in space and, like the cloud in the background, seems as if it might float away. Bronzino's background symbols and scene layering. Pontormo's adopted son and student, Agnolo Bronzino, 1503. 1572, became one of the greatest Mannerist painters. From 1539 to 1560, Bronzino served as court painter to Cosimo I de' Medici, Duke of Florence. Bronzino's paintings are rich with symbolism, which isn't much of a surprise considering that Bronzino was also a poet. The name Bronzino means copper-colored or nicely tanned. Cosimo commissioned a painting from Bronzino that he intended to present as a gift to Francis I, the King of France. The painting turned out to be one of Bronzino's greatest works, Allegory of the Triumph of Venus. The central figures in the painting are Venus and her son Cupid. Venus swipes Cupid's arrow and points it at him. He responds by making love to his own mother. And you thought that only happened on modern-day soap operas. The other figures react with a mixture of shock and glee. The leering old, bald man in the upper right with an hourglass sitting on his back represents time. The identities of the rest of the cast are hotly contested by scholars. It's possible that even the Medici family wanted the painting's meaning to be open-ended so the French court could debate it. Old Man Time and the mask-like figure in the left corner raise a blue curtain to reveal this behind-the-scenes affair. The two masks on the floor suggest that the whole scene is just a theater piece. In the Renaissance, aristocrats often staged mythical love affairs at their private parties. The discarded masks may also suggest that two of the characters in the painting are in the process of revealing their true natures. Figure 13-1, Agnolo Bronzino's Allegory of the Triumph of Venus is one of the most enigmatic paintings of the 16th century. Alinari Art Resource, New York. The blithe child on the right, who may represent folly, playfully pelts the lovers with pink roses to encourage them. The mysterious little girl who offers Venus a honeycomb has been identified as fraud because her body morphs into a monster with clawed feet and a scorpion tail. A dove roosts in the left corner next to Cupid's right foot. The painting includes an even more discordant image than the little girl. A tormented crone wails behind the beautiful bodies of Cupid and his mother. We have no idea what's causing the crone's anguish or who invited her to the party. She is frequently identified as jealousy or despair. Her darkened skin and bad teeth have led some scholars to assume that she represents syphilis, a venereal disease from which the French king suffered. The crone's hideous appearance makes a nice foil for Venus, who holds the golden apple that she won in the beauty contest judged by Paris, which triggered the Trojan War. The golden apple indicates that Venus is the most desirable of all creatures. It also shows that her vanity has no limits, she clenches it while seducing her own son. Of course, spreading love is the job description of both Venus and Cupid. Bronzino has simply taken this fact to its logical, albeit extreme, conclusion. In other words, the painting is a Mannerist pose that goes beyond the bounds of Renaissance order and propriety. What else makes this painting a Mannerist work? The arcane symbolism, the crushed perspective, and the cluttered composition. But also the painting is about vanity, and not just Venus's vanity. Bronzino is showing off, too. He gives a dazzling display of technical bravura in his smooth, polished brushwork, designed to flatter the refined tastes of his highly educated audience. He titillates them while simultaneously offering a contradictory moral message: keep a leash on your passions. Parmigianino, he's not a cheese. Parmigianino might sound like a tasty cheese, but it's actually the name of a tasteful painter whom Pope Clement VII called Raphael Reborn. One of his masterpieces, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, showcases both the artist's good looks and his Mannerist style. In this work, Parmigianino demonstrated that he could maintain classical proportions in a distorting mirror. At the same time, he celebrated vanity, his own. Also, notice that the artist's brush hand presses against the mirror as if it wants to break the barrier between the viewer and the painting. Disrupting traditional Renaissance perspective and playing games with point of view are hallmarks of Mannerist art. Parmigianino's most celebrated work is Madonna with the long neck. The woman's long and large body contrasts surprisingly with her small shoulders, little head, and long neck. Nevertheless, these distortions don't diminish her beauty. Instead, they expand it into rarefied elegance. In Mannerist art, artificial beauty trumps nature. The strange perspective in Madonna with the long neck is another Mannerist feature. The background with the miniature man, white columns, and hazy mountains has a surreal quality like a Salvador Dali dreamscape. It's as if two paintings had been superimposed. The small background man displays a scroll while turning away from it, suggesting that pure display takes precedence over function. In Mannerist art, showiness and artifice always take the front seat. Figure 13-2, Madonna with the long neck, is Parmigianino's most celebrated work. Scala Art Resource, New York. Arcimboldo, à la carte art. The most mannered of the Mannerists is the Milanese painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo. Arcimboldo, who began as a religious fresco painter and a tapestry designer, also painted conventional portraits, but these works aren't well known. In 1562, Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand I hired him as an imperial portrait painter in Vienna and Prague. Not long after, Arcimboldo invented edible portraiture. Although you can't actually eat Arcimboldo's art, it looks like you can. His first foray into this genre was a series based on the seasons, painted in 1563. The paintings were an instant hit, and many artists began to imitate Arcimboldo. In his portrait of summer, Arcimboldo created a personification of this season wearing a coat woven of wheat stalks with an artichoke boutonniere planted in his chest. A golden pear forms the man's chin, his cheeks are ruddy apples, a protruding pickle represents his nose, and his lips and teeth are made from a split pea pod. Of course, apples and pears aren't summer produce. Nonetheless, the man's horn of plenty looks convey a sense of summertime abundance with the promise of a healthy harvest. Arcimboldo painted composite portraits made from a cornucopia of fruit, vegetables, fish, meat, even tree roots. For example, he constructed a fruit basket lady, a man out of cooked chicken parts, and the bust of a librarian from a shelf of books. He even recreated the faces of Adam and Eve out of naked babies, yet Adam and Eve are both dressed in 16th century attire. The infants twist and turn in a variety of cute, sometimes surprising positions to represent Adam and Eve's features. An arched back signifies Eve's ear, a baby's bottom forms the tip of Adam's nose, and a tiny foot delineates each of their upper lips. Eve holds in her hand the apple that led to the duo's expulsion from Eden, while Adam flourishes a scroll with one hand and supports an open book with the other. Why is Adam reading? It illustrates the upside of the fall. Adam is no longer ignorant, thanks to the apple, he can read. Sometimes Arcimboldo actually captured his sitters' looks with his meat and fruit salad caricatures. He concocted a lawyer out of broiled chicken and fish that many of his contemporaries immediately recognized as the emperor's financial administrator, although others argued that it was John Calvin, the Protestant reformist. The barrister's neck is a ream of legal forms and his belly is made from law books. El Greco, stretched to the limit. The real name of the artist known as El Greco is Dominikos Theotokopoulos. But who wants to say all that? Most people simply know him as El Greco. Dominikos Theotokopoulos was born on the Greek island of Crete, then part of the Republic of Venice. As a youth, he learned Greek Orthodox icon painting, which influenced his later work. In the late 1560s, El Greco moved to Venice to study painting with the aging Titian. El Greco's early works show that he thoroughly absorbed the style and techniques of Titian and Tintoretto. In 1570, he relocated to Rome, hoping for papal commissions, but he enjoyed only modest success. In 1577, he moved to Toledo, Spain, where he developed his distinctive Mannerist style. In Spain, El Greco began to elongate his forms. Many of them looked like they'd been stretched on a torture chamber rack. Also, the sun stopped shining in his paintings. Dark, stormy skies became his signature look. The looming, black clouds in El Greco paintings promise more than bad weather, they have an end-of-the-world gloom. He said he wanted to mirror the incarnation by spiritualizing nature. Despite that, there's not a lot of nature in his art. He usually painted peoplescapes. When El Greco included landscapes and cities, they seemed to be infected by his apocalyptic skies. In his The Burial of Count Orgaz, heaven, the upper part of the painting, is a swirling realm of spiritual energies. By contrast, the funeral in the bottom third is orderly and stiff, it seems almost dreamlike by comparison. The Counter-Reformation mysticism of St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila strongly influenced El Greco's work. His art seems to be a painterly transcription of their spirituality. The arrest and imprisonment of the Andalusian cleric later canonized as St. John of the Cross in Toledo the year El Greco arrived must have made a great impression on the newcomer. St. John of the Cross, who'd been imprisoned for trying to reform the local Carmelite order, was publicly lashed once a week for 9 months. In El Greco's fifth seal of the apocalypse that many of his works foreshadow arrives. Revelation 6:9 says, "And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God, and for the testimony which they held." In the painting, the ghostly white male and female martyrs rise up and raise their arms longingly toward descending cherubs. The two lower cherubs look like dive bombers dropping yellow and green mantles over the nudes. Notice that the right-hand martyr grasps a white blanket unfurled by the angel above him. The blanket links heaven and earth, which was El Greco's main preoccupation, on earth as it is in heaven. After his death, El Greco's popularity plummeted. Critics around the world ridiculed him for centuries as extravagant, queer, and ridiculous. Some accused him of madness. In the early 20th century, scholars took a more scientific view. They attributed his twisted, elongated limbs to an astigmatism. But the Expressionists revered him and considered his work a forerunner of their own. They realized that he used distortion to express extreme emotional and spiritual states. Expressionism may have taught the rest of the world how to read his paintings. Today, El Greco is probably the most popular Mannerist artist. Just how unappreciated was El Greco? In 1899, a convent in the province of Toledo, Spain, owned El Greco's Holy Family with Mary Magdalene and used it as a patch over a broken window to keep out the rain. When the town mayor learned that the nuns couldn't afford to fix their window, he paid 4 pesetas to replace it. In gratitude, the head nun gave him the painting. Shortly thereafter, the mayor sold it for 200 pesetas. Eventually Holy Family with Mary Magdalene found its way to the Cleveland Museum of Art. It needed a facelift before it could be displayed. Finding your footing in Giulio Romano's Palazzo Te. Mantua isn't usually on tourists' lists of don't-miss sites in Italy, but it should be. Between Andrea Mantegna's dazzling frescoes in the Ducal Palace and Giulio Romano's Palazzo Te, Mantua is one of Italy's cultural meccas. Like their painter colleagues, Mannerist architects bent the rules. And no one did it more playfully than Giulio Romano, Raphael's top student and adopted son. After Raphael's premature death in 1520, Romano became the head of Raphael's workshop and completed his most important commissions, such as the Sala di Costantino in Rome. Even before Raphael's death, the high Renaissance master entrusted Romano to complete some of his works, including Joanna of Aragon and Saint Margaret. After Raphael's death, Romano's fame gradually spread across Europe. He was so well known in the century after his own death that Shakespeare mentioned him in The Winter's Tale, calling him that rare Italian master, Giulio Romano, who, had he himself eternity and could put breath into his work, would beguile nature of her custom, so perfectly he is her ape. In 1524, the Marquis of Mantua, Federico II Gonzaga, invited Romano to become his court painter and architect. Of Romano's numerous achievements in Mantua, the Palazzo Te is the most outstanding. Romano transformed the Gonzaga stables into a palace, modeled on an ancient Roman villa. The stables were located on the island of Te just outside the southern walls of the city. The palace consists of 4 blocks of apartments that alternate with 4 loggias wrapped around a square courtyard. As a Mannerist, Romano disrupted pure classicism by throwing some architectural surprises and jokes into his design of Palazzo Te. For example, between the columns on the east and west courtyard facades, every third triglyph has slipped out of alignment, as if the palace had been shaken by a selective earthquake on just two sides of the building. A triglyph is a triple scalloped architectural element on an entablature. In addition, giant-sized keystones protrude into the pediments above the arches, as if they'd slipped upward. A keystone is the wedge-shaped stone in the center of an arch that locks the other stones in place. This innovation disrupts the classical order and suggests that the building is unstable, its big keystones can't even hold it together. Also, Romano gave the palace a motley stonework surface. He combined fat stones with skinny and medium-sized ones, some smooth and others rusticated, some protruding and others flush. This variety in the stonework gives the palace an agitated Mannerist feel rather than a classical calm as in Palladio's high Renaissance buildings. On the inside, Palazzo Te is even more impressive. Nearly every room is a masterpiece of design. The most outstanding is Sala dei Giganti. In Greek mythology, after the Olympians defeated and replaced the Titans, the giants tried to overthrow the Olympians. Romano shows Zeus turning back their assault and hurling the defeated big guys to earth. As you enter this room, you feel you've walked into a horrific fray spilling from heaven and engulfing the whole earth. The room itself seems to be caving in. Giants and broken columns tumbled down the walls to the floor. Romano even painted toppling brickwork over one of the entrances so that the doorway looks like it's being crushed. He enhanced these effects with trompe d'oeil, which makes the figures and architecture look sculptural. Even modern cinema, with its arsenal of special effects, can't create a more convincing upheaval. Romano passed his Mannerist style on to his students, especially Francesco Primaticcio, who carried Mannerism to Fontainebleau, where he worked for King Francis I, France's great Renaissance king. From France, Mannerism spread to Northern Europe. Michelangelo learns to be Mannered. While Romano was playing architectural games in Mantua, Michelangelo experimented with Mannerism in Florence. His emerging Mannerist style is evident in the vestibule of the Laurentian Library. Instead of a rectangular, classically cut stairway, the library steps flow like descending wavelets in a man-made waterfall. You don't walk down these steps, you surf. Also, the powerful, double columns that punctuate the neighboring walls are merely decorative. This contradicts the classical ideal that form and function should play equal roles in architecture. Classical columns are beautiful, but they also hold up the roof. Here, decoration tends to conceal function. Chapter 14. When the Renaissance went Baroque. In this chapter, defining Baroque art, tracing Caravaggio's influence, exploring Bernini's sculpture and architecture basking in Baroque light, examining Spanish Baroque. After 150 years, the Renaissance ran out of rebirth. Mannerism came and went like a fashion, and a new 100-year period, the Baroque, took root in the psyches of artists, patrons, and the European public. The Baroque is the artistic side of Catholicism's comeback during the Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church enlisted Baroque art and architecture as weapons in the cultural wars with the Protestants. But Protestant countries adopted the Baroque style, too, adapting it to their own needs. In the Catholic nations, the Baroque tended to serve religion, attracting people to the church with sumptuous or dramatic art and architecture, while Protestant states used the Baroque to create stately, elegant architecture, often to advertise their worldly power or strikingly realistic landscape, still life, and everyday or genre scenes in painting. The Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther in 1517, knocked the wind out of the Catholic Church. Half of Europe turned its back on the Pope. Northern Germany, Scandinavia, England, and part of the Low Countries all converted to Protestantism. To hold on to its shrinking flock, the Church launched the Counter-Reformation, which officially began at the Council of Trent, even though it had unofficially started earlier. The Counter-Reformation cleaned up the Church's act, chastising wayward priests and power-hungry bishops, requiring all clergy to be educated, and founding the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, who underwent a highly rigorous classical training, submitted to the Pope absolutely, founded religious schools throughout Europe, and converted non-Christians. Though the Council of Trent confirmed most church doctrines, the council upheld one of Martin Luther's chief complaints: it condemned the selling of indulgences, which had been widespread for centuries. In addition, the Council of Trent gave Catholicism a Baroque facelift, starting in about 1600. That may have been its most potent reform, because it's what people saw first. What did the facelift look like? Unlike Renaissance art, which inspires quiet contemplation, Baroque art reaches out to people and provokes action. Baroque paintings are filled with dramatic movement, saints in ecstasy or pain. Charging horses, turbulent skies, striking contrasts of light and dark, vivid colors, and earthy realism. Often, Baroque artists depicted the heroic acts of martyrs and saints to inspire the lower classes to accept their own suffering and not lose faith. Baroque architecture reached out to Catholics, welcoming them into churches. Inside, the splendor of sumptuous Baroque relief and sculpture exalted the congregation, inspiring them to participate fervently in their faith. Annibale Carracci, Heavenly Ceilings. Illusionistic ceiling frescoes were fashionable in the Baroque period. Annibale Carracci, born in Bologna in 1560, helped develop the style when he moved to Rome in 1595. 2 years later, Cardinal Oderico Farnese commissioned Carracci to fresco the Palazzo Farnese ceiling to celebrate a wedding in his family. The Farnese frescoes became almost as famous as Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, which was one of Carracci's inspirations. Carracci divided the barrel vault of the Farnese Central Hall into rectangular compartments to frame his animated pictures of mythological love scenes. The lovers in these episodes seem to swarm over the expanse of ceiling, which looks like an upside-down art gallery. Trompe-l'oeil statues of slumbering ignudi and bronze medallions separate the scenes. Before painting the Farnese ceiling, Carracci and his cousin Ludovico founded a highly influential art school in Bologna, where students studied Renaissance and classical art and nature. The students spread the Carracci style throughout Italy. Among the most famous were Giovanni Lanfranco, Domenico Zampieri, known as Domenichino, Guido Reni, and Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, known as Guercino. Lanfranco combined Carracci's revived classicism with Caravaggio's dramatic intensity. Guercino expanded upon Carracci's sense of space in the Farnese ceiling. In his fresco Aurora, painted in the Villa Ludovisi in Rome, the ceiling appears to open up into infinity. Painted architectural forms soar above into a heavenly space where the horses of Aurora charge through the clouds, bringing on the dawn. Shedding light on the subject, Caravaggio and his followers. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, known more simply as Caravaggio, was the greatest and most influential painter of the Baroque style. He was also a quick-tempered bohemian who was often jailed for brawling. In 1606, he knifed a man to death while arguing with him over a tennis match and had to flee Rome. In absentia, a Roman court condemned Caravaggio to death, though he was pardoned toward the end of his life. The fugitive artist settled in Naples a few months later, but had to flee within a year for brawling. From there he journeyed to Malta, where in 1608 he was imprisoned following a quarrel with a powerful knight. He escaped to Sicily, making still more enemies. Eventually, he worked his way back to Naples where he was stabbed in the face, probably by allies of the Maltese knight. The artist survived the wound and continued painting and fighting. The fact that Caravaggio was often on the run helped to spread his extraordinary style, which was soon imitated across Europe. Caravaggio infused his work with more gritty naturalism than any previous artist, hiring common people as models for saints and apostles, which shocked many of his contemporaries. He dramatized his religious scenes by throwing a diagonal light across his subjects, highlighting some of their features and leaving the rest in shadow. Caravaggio's lighting technique is called tenebrism, from the Italian word tenebroso, which means gloomy or murky. His paintings recount climactic moments while powerfully suggesting the events that precede and follow them. Caravaggio created his dramatic lighting effects by letting natural light stream through a high window or with a highly placed lamp that threw a beam down onto his subjects. This technique, known as cellar lighting, yields dramatic effects if the artist positions his models well. In Calling of St. Matthew, the cellar light slashes across the back wall and illuminates the faces of some of the men crowded around a wooden table where Matthew counts his money. 3 of Matthew's companions regard Jesus, who has just entered and stands in the shadows. The cellar lighting streaming through the window almost traces the line of Jesus's index finger, which points at the tax collector Matthew, who's about to change jobs. But the future apostle resists, avoiding Jesus's eyes and staring stubbornly at the stack of coins on the table. The painting illustrates the tug-of-war going on inside Matthew. The tension between light and dark, between pointing fingers and gazing eyes staring in opposite directions, heightens the drama to the breaking point. Notice that despite Matthew's reluctance to sign on, Jesus's feet are already turned toward the exit and the future. Caravaggio was the first to depict a single tense moment and let the tension stretch the moment backward and forward in time. To help break the barrier between a painting and the viewer, Caravaggio and other Baroque painters placed highly illusionistic objects, a bed, a copper bowl, someone's foot, at the bottom edge of their paintings so that the objects appear to project into the viewer's space. You feel that you can touch these objects, so you become more involved in the painting. In the following sections, I examine the work of artists who were influenced by Caravaggio. Orazio Gentileschi, Baroque's gentle side, more or less. Orazio Gentileschi was the first of Caravaggio's many followers. Gentileschi emphasized realism like Caravaggio, and placed his subjects close to the viewer in a stop-action moment as in his The Lute Player. In this sensitively rendered painting, a female lute player, illuminated by Caravaggio's cellar lighting, gently strums her instrument. It's a fine work, but there's no tension and no stirring sensuality as in Caravaggio's The Musicians and the Lute Player. The stop-action in the Gentileschi painting is truly stopped. The frozen moment doesn't pull us in multiple directions as in a Caravaggio painting. One of Gentileschi's most moving works is his Madonna with Child in the Gallery Borghese in Rome. The tender warmth in the mother's face as she gazes at her child is magnified by the lighting. Perhaps the reason Madonna with Child is so convincing is because Gentileschi injected his feelings for his own daughter, Artemisia, into the painting. Gentileschi was very close to his daughter, whom he taught to paint. He taught her so well that by the time Artemisia was 17, she had already surpassed him. Shadow and Light Dramas, Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia Gentileschi wasn't the only female artist in the Baroque period. But she is one of the few to paint historical and religious paintings. Most other female artists were pigeonholed into portrait, still life, and devotional paintings. Among Artemisia's greatest works are Susanna and the Elders, Judith slays Holofernes, and Lucretia. Like the heroines in Lucretia and Susanna and the Elders, Artemisia was raped. Her personal experience resonates in these works. Like her father and Caravaggio, Artemisia placed her figures intimately close to the viewer. The extremely dark background in Lucretia thrusts the sharply lit woman still farther into the viewer's space, while highlighting Lucretia's psychological isolation after her rape. Lucretia squeezes her left breast while clutching a dagger to indicate what's going to happen next. The Ecstasy and the Ecstasy, Bernini sculpture. The statues of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the greatest Baroque sculptor, seem like living stone. They convey both powerful emotion and a lively sense of motion. The feeling of movement is often driven by a wound-up tension as in his remarkable David. Michelangelo's David is a resurrection and extension of classical sculpture. The tension in his David is powerful but passive. It stays inside David's mind and muscles. Bernini's David, on the other hand, is active. He is just half of a violent equation, the unseen Goliath is the other part. You don't see the giant, but you feel his presence and can gauge his distance by David's reaction to him. Baroque tension is not merely internal, it interacts with the space around it, charging it with energy. Bernini's David doesn't seem stuck on his pedestal like Michelangelo's statue. He's ready to fire his sling, and then leap off his platform to finish the job. Active sculpture like this was intended to animate Catholics with religious fervor. Bernini's most compelling work is his Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, which he sculpted for the Cornaro family chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. Because the chapel is dedicated to Saint Teresa of Avila, Bernini sculpted a statue based on her life. Saint Teresa suffered from severe pain. Eventually, she mystically transmuted the pain into ecstasy. She perceived this transmutation as a vision in which an angel repeatedly drove a fiery lance into her heart. The pain was so sweet that I screamed aloud, she explained, but at the same time I felt such infinite sweetness that I wished the pain to last forever. Bernini captures the saint's experience of sweet pain perfectly. You see and feel it in her eyes and mouth, in the limp hand and dangling foot, which link her to the earth, and in her open posture, which invites the pain to stay. The pure joy on the angel's face contrasts strikingly with Teresa's mixed expression of anguish and bliss, especially because the angel is about to pierce Teresa's heart again. The contrast establishes a force field between the saint and angel that gives the sculpture its Baroque dynamism. Figure 14:1, Bernini's ecstasy of Saint Teresa is the Pietà of Baroque sculpture. Scala Art Resource, New York. Embracing Baroque architecture. Baroque architects in Catholic countries strove to make buildings active, inviting, and dramatic. Baroque architecture is driven by a directional point of view that coaxes visitors into the church and draws them through a sequence of increasingly sumptuous forms toward a visual and emotional climax, an explosion of Baroque splendor above the altar. The artwork over the altar usually consists of exquisite relief with playful putty peeking down from clouds surmounted by Christ in his glory framed by a golden sunburst. To achieve these architectural crescendos, designers often decrease the spacing between columns as they get closer to the altar or make columns and pilasters gradually grow, visually leading the congregation forward and upward. Carlo Maderno launched the Baroque movement in architecture when he designed the facade for the Roman church Sta Susanna in 1597. During most of the 16th century, Roman church facades were clean-cut, geometrical Renaissance structures or intentionally disjointed Mannerist buildings. Maderno replaced the static look of Renaissance architecture with dynamism and harmony. The large pediment capping the second level of the church echoes the smaller pediment over the entrance. The second-floor central window frame mirrors the first-floor door frame. The round ground-level columns are replaced by rectangular pilasters on the second level. An elegant scrolls bracket the entire second-floor level, giving the facade an upward, sweeping momentum. Sta Susanna was the launch pad for a style of sumptuous grandeur that would soon make Sta Susanna look bland and uninspired. In 1607, Pope Paul V commissioned Maderno to design a long nave for St. Peter's and to redo the facade. When Maderno died in 1629, Pope Urban VIII replaced him with Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who was also a brilliant architect. His first task was to design a baldacchino over the altar, which would be the focal point of the most important Catholic church in the world. Like many Baroque artists, Bernini often sought to unite painting, sculpture, and architecture in a common front to win back the church's lost flock. By unifying sculpture, relief, and architecture, Bernini made St. Peter's Basilica one of the most uplifting churches in the world. The massive bronze canopy he designed rests on twisted columns that soar about 80 feet high. The canopy is topped by an ornate crown. A golden orb surmounted by a golden cross sits on the crown. While continuing work on the interior, the Pope commissioned Bernini to transform the vast piazza in front of St. Peter's into a welcoming space. He achieved this by designing curved porticos around the piazza, which are connected to two straight porticos that attach to the sides of St. Peter's. The curved porticos reach out to embrace the world like wide-open arms, while the straight porticos draw people into the church. Bernini built the colonnade from simple Tuscan rather than showy Corinthian columns, which would tend to intimidate rather than welcome ordinary people. Baroque buildings were designed to invite crowds to gather around them and to interact with neighboring structures, usually by dominating them. By contrast, Renaissance churches and buildings tend to be more flat and reserved. The Baroque style migrated north as the Renaissance style had in the 16th century. Protestant countries absorbed and modified the style because it was intended to serve different ends. In Holland, for example, the Mauritshuis is a building of stately grandeur, but with decidedly less splash than its Catholic counterparts. The overall impression of Protestant Baroque is one of controlled elegance. Powerful princes and dukes erected palaces in the Baroque style to celebrate their power and awe their subjects. In France, the Palace of Versailles, built in the late 17th century, was designed by the architects of Louis XIV to show the unruly French nobility that an absolute monarch was now in charge. In the Catholic Habsburg monarchy, the Baroque style served to glorify both church and state. Austrian architects began building in the Baroque style after 1690. Two of the greatest structures are Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach's Karlskirche in Vienna, and Jacob Prantauer's Monastery of Melk, which perches on a hilltop above the Danube River. Both buildings look as ornate and appetizing as Vienna's famous desserts. Karlskirche, designed by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach in 1716, is the greatest Baroque church north of Italy. When a plague hit Vienna in 1713, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI vowed to build a church to honor Saint Charles Borromeo, the patron saint of plagues and his namesake, when the pestilence ended. The Baroque masterpiece Karlskirche is the result. Figure 14-2, St. Charles or Karlskirche, designed by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, is the architectural crown of the former Austrian Empire. Andreas Seska. Fischer von Erlach used a hybrid style, harmonizing elements from Italian Baroque, ancient Rome, and modern Rome. The two gateway tower pavilions behind the columns were influenced by Italian Baroque designs of Francesco Borromini and Bernini. The green elliptical dome rises over a Corinthian portico modeled after the Roman Pantheon and the Maison Carrée. A statue of St. Charles Borromeo crowns the pediment. The flanking columns, which are carved with reliefs recounting St. Charles's life, were inspired by Trajan's column in Rome. But there's more to these columns than that. With the death of Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula and its vast New World colonies were lost to the Holy Roman Empire centered in Vienna. The columns of Karlskirche represent the Pillars of Hercules at the southern frontier of Spain. With the columns, Charles VI marked his claim for the last time to a nation that had been part of the Habsburg monarchy for 2 centuries. Dutch and Flemish realism. Spain ruled the Low Countries, also known as the Netherlands, until the northern part won its independence in 1609 and officially became Protestant. But Spain held on to the southern Netherlands, Flanders, which remained staunchly Catholic. Protestant Baroque painting was less exuberant than Catholic Baroque painting. In Holland, it was intended to mirror ordinary life. Sometimes the ordinary scenes had moral messages, but they were not religious subjects. During the Reformation, Protestants had rebelled against the use of images of saints and martyrs in Catholicism. In Holland, religious paintings were banned by the Calvinist government. But in Catholic Flanders, which remained under Spanish control until 1798, artists like Peter Paul Rubens, a devout Catholic, frequently painted religious themes. Nevertheless, Flemish art is less transcendental than its Italian counterpart. The Flemish and Dutch had always been a practical people. Their art reflects that national trait. The Dutch, in particular, loved material goods and were fond of paintings that had a shop window appeal, displaying lifelike objects that you could almost sink your teeth into. The Dutch had a love affair with art, including the still life, which they transformed from a backwater to a mainstream painting genre. Dutch people were proud of their hard-won independence and their thriving mercantilism, and they liked to see Dutch life celebrated in painting. Holland produced a lot of painters to satisfy that love, so many, in fact, that Dutch painters had to specialize. Because art was traded on an open market system rather than by commission. Some artists just painted flowers, others specialized in food or poultry. There were even expert bug painters. This specialization led to collaborative painting. Many artists pooled their talents and made composite canvases. You need a chicken, call so and so, he'll paint you the best fowl in Holland. Want some bugs on your rose petals? Send for Mr. Van Bloom or whomever. The Dutch and Flemish also loved to read into paintings for double meanings. So Dutch artists filled their canvases with visual double entendres and symbolism. Who knows what that bumblebee hovering over a rose or that cooked chicken thigh really represents? In the following sections, I cover the art of the greatest Dutch and Flemish masters, Rubens, Rembrandt, Hals, and Vermeer. Rubens, fleshy, flashy, and holy. The Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens was a master painter, drawer, sculptor, architect, engraver, businessman, and diplomat. He also spoke 7 languages. In 1600, he moved to Italy to study the Italian masters. Shortly after his arrival, he landed the perfect job to realize his goal. The Duke of Mantua, Vincenzo I Gonzaga, hired Rubens as a copyist. His job description: copy the great Italian painters so the Duke could have facsimiles of their masterpieces in his private gallery. What a break! It was like being paid to go to graduate school, the best graduate school in the world. Rubens was also required to paint some of the most beautiful noble women in Italy for the Duke's Beauty Queen Museum. Rubens remained with the Duke for 8 years, painting babes and copying masterpieces. In 1601, Gonzaga sent him to Rome to copy masters like Raphael and Michelangelo. While in the Eternal City, Rubens watched Annibale Carracci's highly disciplined team painting the Farnese Gallery. Rubens later applied Carracci's team approach in his own painting workshop in Antwerp. Before leaving Italy in 1608, Rubens had already evolved his famous Rubenesque style, richly colored, crowded, yet perfectly composed canvases that erupt with boundless vitality. His Fall of Phaeton and especially St. George and the Dragon both royal with characteristic Rubenesque energy. St. George and his horse practically charge off the canvas. In spite of Rubens's stellar talent, Gonzaga never purchased a single Rubens original. Talk about not seeing the talent right under your nose. Rubens's fortes were agitated movement, dramatic lighting, and illusionistic figures that plunge or fall into the viewer's space. Often, his paintings have an upward thrust. Christ Risen illustrates this tendency. Of course, the upward thrust in this painting is symbolic. The angel's drapery and Christ's shroud rise toward heaven as Jesus lifts himself up from his tomb. The illusionism Rubens used to create Christ's left foot, which appears to be perpendicular to the picture plane, makes it look like Jesus is stepping out of the painting. The resurrection appears to occur right in front of the viewer. Never has Christ seemed so earthbound before, even as he rises from the dead. He is both weightless and as solid as a bodybuilder rising from his workout bench. The putty and angel that assist Christ look on in amazement. Only Jesus is unsurprised by his casual yet glorious resurrection. Figure 14:3, Peter Paul Rubens's Christ Risen. Brims with Baroque power and drama. Scala Art Resource, New York. In some ways, Christ Risen is atypical. Rubens's paintings are usually crowded with active people, beefy men and fleshy women sprawl across his canvases, putty tumble from the clouds. In his masterful raising of the cross, the muscular mass of figures is depicted at a 45-degree angle and seems to spill from an invisible cornucopia into the viewer's space. Jesus and the men crucifying him are a river of flesh flowing toward you. Yet the men are raising Christ's cross. This two-directional motion charges the painting with tension. Rembrandt, Self-Portraits and Life in the Shadows. Following Caravaggio's lead, Rembrandt was a master of chiaroscuro and dramatic lighting. He learned to manipulate light and dark for dramatic effect probably from the Utrecht school in Holland, which was influenced by Caravaggio, but also from his teacher Peter Lastman. Lastman was influenced by Tintoretto's unique use of chiaroscuro. In Rembrandt's The Blinding of Samson, instead of light streaming from above, it pours in from an open tent to expose the cruel blinding of the Old Testament strong man. Delilah, holding the scissors with which she cropped Samson's hair and virility, looks back aghast, yet without pity. Like many of Caravaggio's paintings, The Blinding of Samson is rife with action moving in opposite directions. Delilah scuttles away to the left while a Philistine soldier thrusts his spear toward the prone Samson at the right. But in his later work, the light is less like Caravaggio and more like Tintoretto, mysterious and emotive. It suffuses his canvases with a spiritual light. Rembrandt. went beyond either of his predecessors in interpreting human nature. His penetrating portraits and many religious paintings of Old Testament stories reveal the inner world of the characters he so brilliantly depicts. Rembrandt also plumbed the depths of his own character in a lifelong series of self-portraits. Over 60 survive. Compare Rembrandt's Philosopher in Meditation to Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew. Caravaggio spotlights dramatic moments and uses light symbolically. Rembrandt employs a softer, warmer radiance to probe character. Figure 14:4, in Rembrandt's Philosopher in Meditation. The old thinker quietly contemplates the mysteries of life. Gloria Wilder. Philosopher in Meditation illustrates how Rembrandt used light and shadow to suggest meaning through contrast. The steps, winding around a cavern of darkness, symbolize the philosopher's meditative journey into the unknown. The room looks almost like a convex mirror with the coiling stairs and the top of the window arcing into the curve of the upper part of the staircase. The golden light, pouring richly through the window, casts an aura of warm radiance around the philosopher as if he were a cerebral saint. On the opposite side of the room, a woman stokes the fire, taking care of the practical side of life that he probably neglects. For more on Rembrandt's technique, in particular his unique brushwork, see Chapter 29. Laughing with Hals. Frans Hals painted no religious scenes or historical paintings, no landscapes or still lives. His focus was the face, mostly merry ones with wine-red cheeks, either solo or in groups. He had a gift for capturing any fleeting expression that passed over the features of his sitters: an impish smile, a man grinning greedily as he pours his beer, a buxom girl giving a man the eye. Hals is famous for his robust paintings, which look like a cross between a Christmas card and a beer ad, though he illustrated the sober sides of life, too. For example, Hals's Lady Governors of the Old Men's Home at Haarlem depicts the staid and pragmatic directors of the Haarlem Old Men's Home. At first, the elderly women's faces seem solemn, even forbidding. But if you look long enough, a warm humanity begins to glow inside each face, especially in their eyes. Caring for the old men isn't just a job for these women, it's a labor of love. Besides the hints of humanity, a lifetime of experience is etched on each careworn face. In spite of his great talent, Hals was only moderately successful, partly because people took his light and loose brushstroke for laziness. Impressionism has since taught people the expressive power of light and loose application of paint. But in those days, who knew? Young Man with a Skull is one of Hals's most remarkable works. Sensuality and symbolism fight it out in this painting. The boy's confident charm and infatuation with someone outside the frame is undimmed by the gruesome skull in his hand. With the exotic, almost erotic orange feather sprouting from his hat, his dashing good looks, and his unflappable faith in tomorrow, the youth represents Vanitas. He is the joy of life holding death in the palm of his hand. But the ominous skull, which is his future, can't touch him. He's too brimful of life to notice death. Vermeer, musicians, maids, and girls with pearls. In his short life, Johannes Vermeer only created 34 paintings. He painted slowly, fine-tuning his work again and again before releasing it to the buyer, usually Peter van Ruijven. Vermeer's works are not typically Baroque. He didn't use flamboyant colors like Rubens. Nothing jumps off the canvas at the viewer. In fact, his paintings are rather spare and soft-spoken. He usually illustrates a domestic scene with one or two characters in a room containing only a few objects: a piano, a table, a pitcher of water. Everything is still like a stopped clock. And yet there's an inner tension, psychological or spiritual. His subjects are firmly grounded in everyday life: a maid pours milk, a girl strums a guitar, a man turns a globe, yet they are somehow outside the actions they perform. A quiet mystery hangs over Vermeer's paintings like a diaphanous mist you sense but can't see. Vermeer is celebrated for his extremely subtle and sensual use of light, which can be warm and cool in the same painting. The light is often a melange of warm yellow and cool blue filtering in through an open window. The soft, cool radiance makes his paintings seem intimate and aloof at the same time. Vermeer almost always painted the same room. He knew all the room's moods and learned to let them speak on his canvases when the noise of the world was momentarily silenced. Maybe that's why he wouldn't let his wife and 11 children enter his studio. Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring is sometimes called the Mona Lisa of the North. Yet in 1881, Girl with a Pearl Earring sold for just 2 guilders. Vermeer's popularity had sunk that low. Today he is considered one of the greatest 17th-century painters, and Girl with a Pearl Earring is priceless. What's so special about the Mona Lisa of the North other than that she's more fetching than the Mona Lisa of the South? Perhaps it's the fact that she is seductive and innocent at the same time. She is the crossroads where innocence and experience meet up and get to know each other. Also, the contrast between her maid's garb and that thumb-size pearl dangling from her ear is shocking and yet appropriate. How did a maid afford such a large, perfect pearl? Or what did she have to do to get it? But her innocence eliminates the possibility of anything untoward. What's most impressive about Girl with a Pearl Earring isn't the woman's striking looks, but how she looks at the viewer. She is so fascinated by the viewer that she makes you feel special. The black background intensifies this feeling by extracting Girl with a Pearl Earring from her own world, allowing her to enter the viewer's space in a very Baroque way. If you're unable to go to the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague to see this painting, you can get the next best thing by watching the film version of Tracy Chevalier's book Girl with a Pearl Earring. Many of the scenes in this poetic, beautifully shot film look like Vermeer canvases brought to life. French flourish and Baroque light shows. France's Baroque style had an Italian side and a French side. The Italian part is represented by the émigré painters Nicolas Poussin and Claude Lorraine, who spent much of their careers in Rome. The home turf artists and architects include Georges de Latour and Jules Hardouin-Mansart. Poussin the perfect. Nicolas Poussin moved to Rome in 1624 and spent most of his life there. Titian was a major influence on him, but Poussin, who hitched the Baroque style to Greek and Roman art, was more interested in classical forms and harmony than Titian was. Yet his classical settings serve Christian ends. The rectilinear steps of the classical temple in his The Holy Family on the steps lead not only into the sky but also to heaven. The top step simply deadens in the clouds. The Holy Family sits on the stairs. Like friendly but vigilant sentinels, or maybe guides. Yet the stairs invite the viewer to climb more than the holy guides who seem unaware of the viewer. Like other Baroque artists, Poussin places objects at the bottom of the tableau where they are most accessible to the viewer, where he feels as though he can reach them. The viewer is almost tempted to pick an apple from the fruit basket on the ledge. Notice that John the Baptist has already yielded to the temptation and hands an apple to baby Jesus. Jesus with an apple is a traditional motif, suggesting that he will undo Adam and Eve's sin. Thanks to him, the apple won't lead to a second fall but to an ascent up the stairway to heaven. Candlelit Reverie and Georges de Latour. Caravaggio also influenced Georges de Latour, but Latour wasn't a mere follower. Instead of grand religious dramas like the Italian master, Latour created intimate, candlelit settings for his religious and secular paintings. In Latour's paintings, you feel as though you're in the same room with Mary Magdalene or Jesus. His source of illumination is often a solitary candle on a table or in someone's hand rather than an on-high, Caravaggio light. He placed divinity within reach, instead of somewhere beyond the window. In Latour's Joseph the Carpenter, the young Jesus holds a glowing taper to help Joseph cut wood in a very dark room. The candlelight radiates on Christ's face as if it were rising from within him. The light merely glances off the bald head and arms of Joseph. Like Caravaggio, Latour's light strikes his subjects from an angle, dramatically highlighting some features while leaving other parts in shadow. Although Latour lived in the small town of Lorraine, his work came to the attention of King Louis XIII, who in 1638 elevated Latour to painter to the king. Despite the royal favor, after Latour's death, he was largely forgotten until the 20th century. Versailles, architecture as propaganda and the Sun King. To weaken the French nobility, King Louis XIV simply moved away from them. It was a smarter ploy than it appears. The powerful nobles of France had revolted violently during Louis's minority. The experience soured him on nobles, and he never fully trusted them again. When Louis XIV assumed full power in 1661, he transplanted the royal residence from unruly Paris to rural Versailles, 11 miles away. This forced the French nobility to meet him on his own terms. At first, he ordered the 5,000 most defiant nobles to live with him at Versailles so he could prevent them from brewing revolutions behind his back. A palace that could accommodate 5,000 nobles and their retinues and families had to be enormous. So Louis transformed his father Louis XIII's somewhat modest hunting lodge into the greatest palace the world had ever known, built on 2,000 acres of land. To achieve his vision of architectural splendor, Louis XIV hired Louis Le Vauve and then Jules Hardouin-Mansart. Hardouin-Mansart's most famous design is the Hall of Mirrors, 357 mirrors framed by 17 arches, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Ending World War I, Louis commissioned André Le Nôtre to design the vast formal gardens and fabulous fountains, which are arranged symmetrically about a vertical axis that begins at the back doors of the palace and extends through the Grand Canal. The king hired Charles Le Brun to design the interior frescoes, relief, and sculpture, all of which he did in a highly sumptuous Baroque style. The grandiose Palace of Versailles was designed to be the visible symbol of the Sun King's absolute power. Like many other monarchs, Louis viewed himself as God's representative on earth. The power of church and state were united in him. L'état, c'est moi is one of his most characteristic statements. In the limelight with Caravaggio, the Spanish Golden Age. Spain produced no homegrown artists in the 16th century. The Spanish court preferred imports like El Greco and especially Italian artists such as Titian. After Columbus's discovery of the New World, Spain acquired a vast empire. In addition, the Spanish crown had to govern Europe's most multicultural population and was at continual war with its neighbors. The Spanish kings didn't have the time or inclination to nurture homegrown art. But after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Spain's power declined and the royal attitude toward Spanish art changed. King Philip IV, a poet and art fan, nurtured all the arts, sponsored a painting competition, and hired Diego Velázquez to be his principal court painter. 17th-century Spain produced a slew of great painters such as Velázquez, José Ribera, Francisco Zurbarán, and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and brilliant novelists, poets, and dramatists, like Miguel de Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and Pedro Calderón de la Barca. The era became known as Spain's Golden Age. Ribera and Zurbarán, in the shadow of Caravaggio. Like so many other artists of the time, Giuseppe de Ribera went to Rome, the art capital of the Western world, to study painting in about 1613. Later, he moved to Naples where he remained for the rest of his life. In Rome, Ribera became an ardent disciple of Caravaggio. Like Caravaggio, Ribera used striking contrasts between light and dark and chiaroscuro to heighten the drama in his paintings. Counter-Reformation clergy and political leaders often commissioned paintings of martyrs to inspire Catholics not to lose their faith and to attract Protestants back to the Catholic fold. Like Caravaggio, Ribera typically used street people as models for his martyrs, giving his religious paintings an earthy look. Ribera's Saint Jerome has an emaciated, been-through-it-all body. Similarly, in his The Martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew, he depicts a careworn, rustic-looking saint confronted by a coarse executioner who looks like a mafia hitman. Like Caravaggio, Ribera dramatizes the events he paints, in this case, by having the saint spread his old but muscular arms heroically to accept the blade of his brutal executioner. Saint Bartholomew was flayed alive. Francisco de Zurbarán also studied in Rome and adopted many of Caravaggio's techniques. In fact, he was dubbed by his countrymen the Spanish Caravaggio. But the figures in his religious paintings are less rugged than Caravaggio's. In fact, they tend to look like middle-class sitters rather than laborers and street people. For example, the model in his Ecstasy of Saint Francis looks as well-educated and middle-class as the Real Saint Francis, whose father was a wealthy cloth merchant. Zurbarán was commissioned to paint many religious paintings for King Philip IV, who supported artists who shared his Counter-Reformation ideals. Zurbaran's paintings so impressed Philip IV that he granted the artist the title, Painter to the King. Velázquez, Kings and Princesses. Like Ribera and Zurbaran, Diego de Velázquez also traveled to Rome to study, first from 1629 to 1631, and then between 1649 and 1651. In 1623, King Philip IV, one of Velázquez's biggest fans, appointed him to be his principal court painter. He remained the king's court painter for the rest of his life. Velázquez developed a very free and loose brushstroke, so that, up close, his canvases look like a jumble of crisscrossing brushstrokes. But when you step back, those loose strokes tighten into a sharp image. To achieve this effect, Velázquez used long-handled brushes so he could see the effect of his strokes from a distance. Many of Velázquez's early works show a strong Caravaggio influence. But later on, the Caravaggio elements become simply a handful of the many ingredients in Velázquez's unique style. Los Borrachos and Joseph's Bloody Coat brought to Jacob are among Velázquez's most Caravaggio-like paintings. He painted Los Borrachos just before going to Italy. But Caravaggio's style had infiltrated Spain a few years earlier through intercourse with Dutch and Flemish artists. Also, Rubens traveled to Spain in 1628 and spent a lot of time with Velázquez, whom he persuaded to travel to Italy. Velázquez's greatest work, Los Meneses, is really 2 paintings, and possibly more. The viewer sees one of the paintings in the mirror. Velázquez is in the process of painting either the picture you see in figure 14.5 or a portrait of King Philip IV and his Queen Marie-Anne of Austria, whose reflections appear in the mirror. Velázquez stares at them like models while painting. At the same time, the artist gazes at the viewer, because the viewer stands in the same spot as the king and queen. The Infanta Marguerite and one of the maids of honor also focus on the royal couple. Interestingly, the principal figures in Los Meneses aren't posing. They are simply being themselves, caught off guard like actors between scenes. Some people believe the princess got dolled up to be painted. After all, she is the subject. Isn't she? Is she about to join her parents on the viewer's side of the picture frame so she can pose for the king's greatest painter? Or have the king and queen walked in to check the progress of the princess's portrait and Velázquez has momentarily looked up from his task? Figure 14.5, Los Meneses. Is Velázquez's most intriguing work. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Chapter 15. Going Loco with Rococo. In this chapter, reeling in the Rococo, scoping out sexy French art, checking in with the Brits. Think of Rococo art and architecture as over the top. Baroque or Baroque on a binge. In the early 18th century, the upper classes, first in France, then all over Europe, rejected Baroque sobriety and got drunk on ornamentation, swirling, fanciful curves, bright pastel colors, dripping gold filigree, and sensuous scenery. Unlike robust, regal, and dramatic Baroque, Rococo is light, delicate, and playful. Baroque, which was at the service of the church, lifted people to heaven. Rococo brought people fluttering back to earth. Sublime spirituality was swapped for elegant sensuality. At the time, the new style was called genre pittoresque. The term Rococo didn't come into vogue until the end of the 18th century, when the style was already passé. Instead of ecstatic saints in candlelit settings, portraits of imperious kings, and heroic scenes, Rococo artists favored sunbathed, idyllic landscapes inhabited by pleasure-seeking aristocrats like François Boucher's Lovers in a Park and Jean-Honoré Fragonard's Blindman's Bluff. They also delighted in painting mythological escapades with naked nymphs frolicking in pastoral settings, such as Boucher's Diana leaving her bath and Hercules and Omphale. Gilded Rococo palace ceilings, like the Kaisersaal in Würzburg, Germany, often feature chubby cherubs eavesdropping from puffy clouds on the party below. Such paintings imply that even angels approved of the 18th-century jet-set lifestyle. But to the poor, who paid for the party, the whole period had a let-them-eat-cake feel and helped ignite the French Revolution of 1789. The celebration started when King Louis XIV died in 1715. French aristocrats felt liberated after 72 years under Louis's autocratic rule. While the new ruler Louis XV, who was only 5, was growing up, the aristocrats partied. The party didn't stop when Louis matured. French architecture appeared to celebrate with them. Rococo architects transformed palaces into playgrounds. Chateau walls and furnishings, Parisian apartments and salons dripped with flamboyant ornamentation, gilding spread across palace ceilings in webs of gold and silver filigree. The nobility and the new king commissioned artists like Antoine Watteau, Boucher, and Fragonard to decorate their chateaux with paintings that depicted the aristocratic life as a non-stop pageant of pleasures. Rococo design was contagious and spread like wildfire across Europe. It seemed everybody wanted to lighten up, although in southern Germany and Austria, Rococo was harnessed by the Catholic Church. But the flamboyant style didn't transplant well in sober England. Instead, English artists like William Hogarth, Thomas Gainsborough, and Sir Joshua Reynolds, as well as the architect Sir Christopher Wren, developed a formal variant of Baroque, geared to English tastes. Breaking with the Baroque, Antoine Watteau. It took the party a while to heat up. The first great artist of the Rococo, Antoine Watteau, was tame compared to those who appeared later. He depicted scenes of earthly paradise in which elegant aristocrats quietly cavort, watch actors, or listen to musicians. The all-powerful French Royal Academy created a new genre, faits galantes, to classify Watteau's paintings. Watteau's landscapes are usually dressed in mist, which blends trees, hills, seas, and sky into a poetic space where only beautiful, graceful things can happen. The mistiness also helps to distance the scenes from the real world. Any flaws are hidden in these fuzzy, faraway Arcadias. Watteau often mixed theater and real life in his paintings, which are like plays on canvas. Many of them feature actors from the Italian Commedia dell'arte, a 16th to 18th century improvisational theater played by comic stock characters like Harlequin, Columbina, and Pulcinella. In Watteau's painting Love in the Italian Theater, Harlequin strums his guitar around a glowing torch, while other actors and aristocrats look on in quiet amusement. This painting was actually a little radical for its day, because Commedia dell'arte was banned in France during the last years of Louis XIV's reign. Watteau's Gillis and 4 other characters from the Commedia dell'arte shows a sadder side of the period. Pierrot stands alone on stage to face the viewer, his only audience. He seems to be waiting for applause that he knows will never come. The sad-faced, white-on-white clown has been left out of his companions' revels. With his traditional oversized clothes, it seems he'll never fit in. Figure 15-1, Watteau's Gillis and 4 other characters from the Commedia dell'arte shows the dark side of the Rococo. Some people got left out. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Fragonard and Boucher, lush, lusty, and lavish. François Boucher and Jean-Honoré Fragonard revved up the party. Although they depicted the exhibitionist variety of sex from a sanitized distance in their mythological paintings, they also strongly hinted at it in their painterly transcriptions of day-to-day aristocratic life. Couching sexuality in elegant surroundings made it palatable to the tastes of the day. François Boucher. The paintings of François Boucher are so sexy, at least by 18th century standards, that many of his contemporaries, including Denis Diderot, condemned some of them as pornographic. But Louis XV's influential, art-loving mistress, Madame de Pompadour, adored Boucher and his work, so he got away with it. Boucher's paintings have the look of a rich woman's boudoir, so soft and sensual, they seem to exhale French perfume. In his Cupid a Captive, he gently mocks the boy god of love, Cupid, who gets caught in his own snare. Instead of Cupid wounding hearts with his famous flaming arrows, now he's the prisoner of several women in a pleasure garden. His chains are their arms and legs. One of the nymphs has snatched his arrows, rendering him defenseless. Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Jean-Honoré Fragonard was Boucher's student, and Boucher's influence shows in some of Fragonard's paintings, including The Bathers, which may be even more orgiastic than his teacher's works. But Fragonard also painted sun-suffused landscapes inhabited by powdered nobles, reminiscent of Watteau's work. But even in these paintings, there are erotic undercurrents. At first glance, the swing depicts a pleasant afternoon outing. A man pushes a lovely woman on a swing, and a handsome young man sitting in front of her innocently watches. Nearby shadowy putty statues observe the entertainment as if they were alive and might join in. But the viewer tends not to notice them immediately. The woman's luminous pink dress holds the viewer's attention as she flies through the air, suspended in her pleasure. Closer inspection reveals that one of her shoes has flown off. The wide-eyed man in front of her is dazzled, not because her shoe is flying through the air, but because he can see up her dress. But then again, maybe he isn't gawking. This maybe haze, maybe he isn't tension made the painting both titillating and acceptable. It tightrope walked the line of 18th century morality. Though the intended subtext of the painting is certainly erotic, the unintended subtext is that the rich lived in blissful isolation, cushioned by their pleasures from the tribulations of the poor struggling all around them. Figure 15-2, Fragonard. The swing touts sexuality behind a guise of innocence. Art Resource, New York. 22 years after Fragonard painted the swing, the French Revolution unleashed the pent-up resentment of the underclasses. By that time, sensual Rococo paintings had fallen out of favor and Fragonard was living in poverty. Flying High, Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo injected religion back into 18th century art. He painted many altarpieces for Italian churches in Venice, Milan, Bergamo, and Padua. He is best known for his frescoes, which won him international fame. He painted sumptuous celestial ceilings in palaces and churches all over Europe, including the Kaisersaal in Würzburg, Germany, mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. The main characters in his frescoes are usually pale-colored saints and angels, mythological figures in diaphanous, windswept gowns, or historical figures. Typically, they recline on sun-drenched clouds that float like islands through heaven or Olympus. By the middle of the century, Tiepolo was the most sought-after painter in Europe. Rococo Light, the movement in England. Although Rococo never got a foothold on British soil, English artists still felt its influence like a fresh breeze from across the English Channel. Without becoming flamboyant, a new, lighter look infused English art. The two leading British painters of the period, Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds, were both influenced by Watteau, as well as Italian Renaissance and Baroque artists and Dutch and Flemish painting. The third great 18th century British painter was William Hogarth. England hadn't had a major painter in 200 years. In the 18th century, England produced three. Sir Joshua Reynolds, the first president of Britain's Royal Academy of Arts, acknowledged this fact while praising his rival Thomas Gainsborough. If ever this nation should produce genius sufficient to acquire to us the honorable distinction of an English school, the name of Gainsborough will be transmitted to posterity, in the history of art, among the very first of that rising name. William Hogarth. The woodblock prints of William Hogarth caricature upper-class Englishmen. Hogarth was one of the few artists of the period who used his talent to critique and mock the upper classes, their excesses, extravagance, and moral depravity. He had trained to become an engraver and later switched to painting. But the engraver in him never died. In fact, he made engravings of some of his paintings so he could sell multiple copies of them. Smart guy. Like Watteau's work, Hogarth's paintings look like theater pieces, in this case, comedies of manners. He created series of paintings that tell stories like cartoon strips. Each painting is a chapter in the story. His first moral painting series is called A Harlot's Progress. It was a sensation. The series chronicles the conversion of a country bumpkin into a city prostitute and follows her gradual decline. Hogarth even depicts the woman's horrid death and funeral as a moral lesson. He followed this series with a second hit, The Rake's Progress. This painted story follows the moral collapse of Tom Rakewell. In one of the episodes, The Orgy, Tom drinks himself into a stupor at a brothel. Though a prostitute caresses his chest, he looks too nauseated to notice. In the dark background, a servant holding out a candle looks on aghast at the scene. Clothes lie about in disarray. Some of the women brazenly hold flasks of rum or whiskey, one threatens another with a knife. Beside them, a client chokes a woman who's flirting with him. The final painting in the series finds Tom Rakewell in a lunatic asylum. Although Hogarth's paintings and engravings are intended to be moral lessons, his art never feels preachy. Each painting brims with entertaining and often humorous details. Thomas Gainsborough. The paintings of Thomas Gainsborough have perfect manners. Everything and everyone is in its proper place. His specialty was portraits of English gentry and aristocrats and wholesome English landscapes. He began as a landscape painter but found that painting portraits was more profitable. Even so, Gainsborough never abandoned landscape painting. He often placed his country ladies and gents in the sedate English countryside. For example, in his great portrait Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, Gainsborough poses the elegantly dressed Andrews couple in a beautiful late-day countryscape. Mrs. Andrews, attired in a blue taffeta dress and pointed, pink velvet slippers, looks like she's ready to go to the opera, yet she's at ease in her rural surroundings. Mr. Andrews, with his trusty English whippet at his side, appears ready for a fox hunt. But his elegant white jacket and white hose aren't up for a rustic jaunt. As rural gentry, they're very much in their element. Yet they've obviously never lifted a hoe. They own the land, but they don't work it. In fact, the landscape looks like it's been tamed by his gun and her dress. To facilitate their comfort, Gainsborough planted an ornate wrought iron bench in the midst of the meadow. The bench on which the lady perches and on which the man leans further separates them from the landscape that they dominate. The British Empire was on the rise during this period. 150 years later, Great Britain ruled a quarter of the world's people. Paintings showing upper-class Englishmen mastering the land were very popular in the mid-18th century. Sir Joshua Reynolds. Sir Joshua Reynolds brought Italy to England. He'd studied in Rome from 1750 to 1752 and then taken the grand tour of Italy. Highly influenced by Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and the Mannerist Giulio Romano, he imported what he called the Great Style to England. As the first president of the Royal Academy of Art, Reynolds helped shape artistic tastes throughout Great Britain. Near the end of Reynolds's career, he told his students in one of his famous discourses, "I should desire that the last words which I should pronounce in this academy, and from this place, might be the name of Michelangelo." Reynolds hoped to bring Italian subject matter to England, too, in particular, mythological and historical painting. But British tastes inclined toward portraiture. 16th and 17th century foreign painters who'd worked in England, like Hans Holbein and Anthony van Dyck, focused on portraits, helping foster a taste for that kind of painting. So like his rival Thomas Gainsborough, Reynolds painted portraits. The most striking difference in their styles is in how they posed their models and embedded them in their surroundings. Gainsborough's models sit like they're posing for their picture between sips of tea. The background is just that, background. The sitters don't interact with it. The figures in Reynolds's portraits are almost always active and dramatically or poetically wedded to the landscape. Reynolds incorporated the landscapes he found in Italian art into his portraits of English lords and ladies, especially after 1760. Often, he placed English women in Italianesque settings accented with a Greek column or bust or a Roman arch or relief. Frequently, the ladies wear flowing Roman gowns and make grand or poetic gestures. Reynolds was so inspired by Romano that he actually borrowed poses and even figures from his paintings. He said, "Genius is the child of imitation." In Lady Sarah Bunbury Sacrificing to the Graces, he transforms Lady Bunbury into a Roman priestess of the patrician class. Any flaws in the actual woman's features have been corrected. She is as idealized as a Raphael Madonna. The settings for Reynolds's portraits of men are usually heroic. For example, he depicted the British Admiral Augustus Keppel, who fought in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, walking boldly along a darkened stone path backed by Gothic scenery and a tempestuous sea. Hogarth, Gainsborough, and Reynolds did create a world-class English school of painting as Reynolds had hoped. The next great school of English artists, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, built on their achievements, primarily by rebelling against the aesthetics of Reynolds. Part 4. The Industrial Revolution and Artistic Devolution, 1760-1900. In this part, the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of people's jobs, the way cities looked and smelled, and the way artists made art. All these transformations are interconnected. In this part, you see how art mirrors those changes and how many artists tried to stimulate or provoke improvements in society, some by retreating to the past, some by rechanneling the Industrial Revolution in a more humane and artsy direction, and others by trying to inspire democratic and social revolutions. Chapter 16. All roads lead back to Rome and Greece, Neoclassical Art. In this chapter, seeing how the Enlightenment affected art, connecting painting and politics, reading between the brushstrokes. The 18th century Enlightenment philosophers thought they'd found the light that went out when ancient Rome fell. Reason, not faith, was their torch. It would illuminate man's path to political and social reform, reveal nature's secrets, and elucidate God's plan, if he has one. Enlightenment thinkers advocated natural science and natural religion, all subject to irreasonable laws that can be deduced using rational inquiry and the scientific method pioneered by Galileo and René Descartes in the 17th century. Enlightenment philosophers viewed with horror the faith-driven wars of the Reformation, which devastated Europe. They witnessed irrational emotionalism and prejudice in their own day that led to religious intolerance, poverty, injustice, and censorship of new ideas in most countries and households. It was time for the pendulum to swing from the heart to the head, from faith to reason. The German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant said, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when it comes not from lack of understanding, but from lack of determination and courage to use without outside guidance. Sapere aude. That is the motto of the Enlightenment." 150 years earlier Galileo Galilei said practically the same thing. "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect intended us to forego their use." The Holy Inquisition put Galileo under house arrest for the last 9 years of his life for using his reason to contradict the Church's faith-driven geocentric view of the universe. Enlightenment thinkers were an optimistic bunch. Despite what happened to Galileo and the fact that many of them were censored, exiled, and imprisoned, most were convinced that man could solve his own problems through calm reason. Today, when you tell someone, "calm down and think," or "look before you leap," you're subscribing to an Enlightenment attitude, whether you realize it or not. Among the greatest and most influential Enlightenment thinkers were John Locke, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, Montesquieu, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, Immanuel Kant, and David Hume. Many of these figures were influenced by the great 17th-century rationalists René Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton. Voltaire preached freedom of religion and separation of church and state, the right to a fair trial, and civil liberties. John Locke said a government is legitimate only if it has the consent of the governed, and only if it guarantees the natural liberties of life, liberty, and estate. Montesquieu advocated separation of powers into 3 independent but interlinked branches of government. These and other Enlightenment thinkers inspired the American and French revolutions, the U.S. Bill of Rights, and the French Rights of Man, as well as the U.S. and French constitutions. They inspired democratic and independence movements from Venezuela to Greece, and they turned on enlightened monarchs like Catherine the Great and Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, who instituted humanistic reforms like abolishing serfdom and building public schools. Rousseau called for didactic art and a return to high-minded classicism. He condemned what he considered the frivolous art of the Rococo, especially the playfully erotic paintings of François Boucher. Enlightenment ideals birthed the neoclassical art style, which was originally called the true style, to contrast it with the artificiality of Rococo art, which was fashionable until around 1760. Johann Joachim Winckelmann, the German art historian and founder of the Greek revival in art, said that the true style should have a noble simplicity and calm grandeur. Although he wanted to revive Greek art, he rejected carbon copies of it. Instead, he encouraged a recharging of the ancient spirit. He believed this would produce an updated version of Greek art, a marriage of the classical style with Enlightenment thinking, neoclassicism. In this chapter, we examine 18th-century art that reflected Enlightenment ideals. Jacques-Louis David, the king of neoclassicism. Jacques-Louis David, the greatest neoclassical painter, was highly influenced by Winckelmann. David's first masterpiece, The Oath of the Horatii, exemplified the noble simplicity and calm grandeur that Winckelmann advocated. Grand, formal, and retro. Louis XVI gave David his first big job as a painter. Actually, the king's director of arts and buildings, Count d'Angevilliers, presented David the commission on the king's authority. Count d'Angevilliers decided that France needed historical paintings with high-minded themes that would inspire patriotism. The Count hired David to paint a historical canvas that would promote unwavering patriotism as the threat of revolution loomed. David chose to illustrate a fanciful story about an ancient war between Rome and a rival city-state, Alba. Instead of clashing armies, the war was simply a showdown between two groups of brothers, the three Horatii boys, who lived in Rome, and their Curiatii cousins who resided in Alba, kind of like an early version of a mob war. He called the painting The Oath of the Horatii. In the painting, the father of the Horatii brothers hands them their swords. The weeping women on the right have ties to both bands of young men, the ones we see and the off-canvas Curiatii. One of the women is a Horatii who's engaged to a Curiatii. Another is a Curiatii who's married to a Horatii. It's like two Romeo and Juliet stories rolled into one, complete with rhymes. But the moral isn't that love conquers all, it's that patriotism overrides love. The Oath of the Horatii expresses a rational, geometric sense of order and total commitment to the state, without messy emotion to distort the classical proportions of the figures or the background. The three classical arches resting on Greek Doric columns frame the action. Nothing spills over the edges of this perfectly composed painting. That would be emotional, sloppy, and anti-classical. David does include some sentiment, but it's reserved feeling, a classical grief, so softened and restrained that it doesn't distort the women's beauty. Notice that the soft, pliant forms of the weeping women contrast with the three shining swords and the steely men, balancing the painting pictorially and emotionally. Compare David's Horatii to Myron's classical Discobolus. Though the discus thrower is performing a strenuous feat, there's no sign of strain on his face, no distortion anywhere to mar the harmony of his perfect form. This comparison should help you recognize the classical look of David's The Oath of the Horatii. David painted the anatomies of the figures in The Oath of the Horatii with near scientific precision. It's reported that to get the father's foot right, he redid it more than 20 times. In his essay on painting, Diderot said, "There are sublime gestures that all the eloquence of oratory will never express." He recommended that painters include sublime gestures in their work that teach moral messages. In The Oath of the Horatii, David achieved Diderot's goal. He expressed the sublime with an economical neoclassical body language of gestures. The oath itself is the most potent gesture in the painting. The unyielding Horatii practically Nazi salute their father to indicate that patriotism takes precedence over personal feelings. In fact, the men appear to have no feelings other than patriotism, while the women look as though they're on sedatives. Propagandist for all sides. During the French Revolution, David quit painting what amounted to propaganda pictures for King Louis XVI and joined the radical Jacobins who overthrew the king. David idolized the Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror. David also signed the king's death warrant in 1792 with most of the Jacobins. The Reign of Terror was the 11-month purge of so-called counter-revolutionaries during the French Revolution. During this period, between 18,000 and 40,000 people were beheaded or beaten to death by mobs. One of David's most famous paintings is of his friend and fellow Jacobin, Jean-Paul Marat, who was murdered in his bathtub by the political moderate Charlotte Corday. Corday connived her way into Marat's bathroom by posing as an informant. She claimed that she had a list of lukewarm revolutionaries, the kind of people Marat routinely carted off to the guillotine. As he scribbled down the names, she pulled out a knife and stabbed him. In David's painting, Marat still holds Corday's letter in his left hand, he grips the pen in his right. The bloody knife lies inches from his body, a more potent weapon than Marat's bloody pen, which had sent so many to the guillotine. The bold inscriptions on the painting read, "A Marat, David," suggesting that the painting was a tribute to his friend. But the inscription was written as one might sign a letter, so the letter motif comes round full circle. Corday delivered a letter, Marat began copying it and was stabbed, and David turned the whole painting into a farewell letter to his friend. Notice that the white handle of the knife links it visually to the white feathers of Marat's two quills. The pen